So it's about as official as it can get. A lot of the details already have leaked out. The NFL owners at this point are just going to vote for it in the middle of the week, and it's going to go through. Adam Schefter reported it. It's the real deal. The NFL is adding a 17th game, not to next season, to this season, the 2021 season. So there will be a week 17. Well, there's always a week 17, a week 18 of the NFL, a 17 game season, and I just don't know how to feel about that. So let's talk about it. Before I get into that, I want to make sure you guys hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, ding that notification bell so you can be notified when I upload. Also, I want to make sure I give a shout out to the patreon.com dog check tier members. And as always, I start with Michael Matique, the most dangerous man in Cleveland, DJ, Marino V, Cleveland Cart, Matt H, Greedy Shoulder, Gemini, Liam Freeman, Fight Dirty 74, Yo-Yo, Matt Lloyd, Paul Wilcox, Hundo, Magnifico, Rob Ferron, Kyle Stouffer, Lukey from Munich, Deveroff, J Guy 101, Musty Taco, Joe Bobby, Brad Cabo, Dylon W, James McGinty, Erinda Hall, Rex Kaufman, Chad Gimme, David Maldonado, Andrew Sadeo, Dylan Hill, Josh Bendor, Jalil Salim Jr., Martha Crustnut, Mark M, TJ Showman, Stuart Moore, Bubbo Regretti, Anthony O, Cleveland BCI, Robert Jermaine Jr., Dave Mike May, John Cummings, Andrew Hirsch, Curtis Bear, Batman Rush Sharir, Barack Kumar, John Albert, Beerman 069, Masayua, Buds of Roland, James Nemo, Mac House, Reeve Hurst, Philip Wilcoxon, Marie Vivert, Keith Anderson, Sean Barron, Goggles Bizano, Corporal Nick Lopez, Don Godzillo, Nick Nasty, Ian Williker, Colin 216, Anthony Latham, Christian, Matt Bond, Dave Strong, Michael Stone, Soul Train, Charles Work, Billy, Michael Holdernack, Moose Gentry, Austin Z, Mark Burnett II, Andre Griffin, Otis Wolf, IT Rex, Greg Ehlers, Lydia, Austin Bolin, Kirkabard, Jesus Serrano, Chris Fawn, Pickdown, Browns Backers, Mark Kahn, Johan Hulf, Kevin Johnson, Max Aldojo, and Water Bear Marketing. Again, guys, thank you so much for your support on Patreon, YouTube, Twitter, wherever you give it. I love it. Thank you guys so much. Now, let's talk about this week 7, no, not week 17, game 17 of the NFL season. So inherently, right, the ideal of there being a 17th game does not bother me as much as the thought of how the NFL is going to try to implement that extra game. Are they just going to add an extra game in? How are they going to figure out who that opponent is? What's the process that's going to go in there? Those things matter, right? Now that it's an uneven number of games. Who decides what teams get 9 home games versus 8 home games, right? The implication of this is very complex and matters a lot. It can turn the week 17 thing something to be very fun to something that is very, very just useless at some point, right? So that is my big concern about the 17th game in the schedule. I can see some downsides. I can see some upsides. Honestly, I'm going to be realistic with you. I see more downsides than upside to this extra game. But again, things are going to change. The NFL wasn't always at 16 games. They were once at 12. They went to 14. They went to 16. They'll survive going to 17, even though I just think 17 is a really weird number to land on, but I don't see them going to 18 within the next few years. Maybe in like 10 years, they'll probably go to 18. They're probably going to go to 18, right? The NFL owners are greedy enough to go to 18. But for every specific situation, my point is that this is going to be different for each team, right? You got older teams that I think this is going to be a huge burden on how they figure out. Like a team like the Steelers, who are going to be good enough to contend in the playoffs, but not necessarily a team you're going to have pegged to make a bye week. You know, I know they got it. Well, they didn't get it last year. They did it at all. But they're a team that could be in contention in the wild card, but they're also a pretty old team. And that is an issue when you talk about adding an extra game, because we saw how things broke down with Ben Roethlisberger in that entire team by week 12. Imagine adding another week onto that and see what that does to that team. For younger teams, I can see this being beneficial. For teams that have developmental prospects, I can see this being beneficial. But how does this go out for the Browns? Well, let's talk about the bad for the Browns. So a lot of this stuff is universal, right? And I'm looking at this from the football team's perspective and also a little bit from the fan perspective, even though I don't really think this is going to really affect how fans view the season, and it's except for in some specific areas. But for the Browns, I think this is going to be bad for them because the extra mileage is going to kind of take its toll on the team. I'd be interested here. Are they adding an extra roster spot or two to go along with this expansion of games? Because I think they should allow teams to be deeper, but given that they didn't raise the salary cap, or they're not going to raise the salary cap, probably not realistic they're going to do that. But the Browns are a run-heavy team, right? And when you talk about mileage with teams, it's teams that have a ton of physical contact on the offensive side of the ball that tend to struggle with that. The Browns, they run the ball a lot. Now they have Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb. They have two top-tier running backs that they can kind of split those carries with. So it's a mitigated fear, but it's still a fear that's there. Also, the thing that I'm more concerned about is Myles Garrett. Getting him, the goal is to get to the Super Bowl, right? So it's 4 games plus a 17th one. So it's 21 weeks. Myles Garrett is overused as he is in that defense. That is a concern, right? That should put more of the onus on the Browns to get somebody really good to be that opposite running mate of him, and also somebody good to just come in and take reps for him so he can get some breathers during the season. Because again, this has been a trend for Myles Garrett for a couple of years. He'll play really good for 10 games, and then he's playing really good, but he's just a little bit gassed for the last half of the season. And that's going to be bigger when the regular season is longer, which means that he's going to be even more tired in the most important games unless you get him some backup help, right? They need to get some depth to help Myles catch his breath. And I know a lot of it was kind of thrown on him having the virus last year, but this is something that's been with Myles for 2-3 years at this point that kind of needs to be managed if you're the Cleveland Browns. And I hope they're proactive in managing that because, again, tired Myles could lead to injuries. All of these things that every other team has to worry about are going to be there, but you're talking about your franchise defensive player. Also, another thing that I kind of noticed about the implementation of this and the way they're implementing this is that the NFL is adding a interconference week at the end of the season for this year. I don't know what they're doing next year. I hope they're not doing this for some reasons I'm about to point out next year, but that's how they're doing that. So at the end of the season, I think they have the list of games already out. The Browns will be hosting the Cardinals, and the AFC and the NFC are going to rotate which side of the conference hosts the home or away game. So this year, the AFC teams are hosting, so they get the extra home game. Next year, the NFC teams. Now, this is the problem with having an odd number of games with how the NFL is set up. It kind of puts you in a position to either make things incredibly unfair at the end of the season with how you're going to schedule this, or just kind of pointless. And this is the direction I see this going with the 17th game, is that it's going to be pretty pointless. A lot of these are interconference games. So we know from watching the Browns tiebreaker situation last year, those interconference games matter the least out of all games you can play, right? There is AFC games, there's division games. Those matter a ton, right? Because your tiebreaker is determined on first your division record, then your conference record. Then that's it, right? Nobody cares after that. So these NFC games, unless you're gaining a whole game on somebody, which is not really likely at the end of the season, are pretty pointless. And I think you're going to see this, right? The week 17 of the NFL in previous years, the last regular season week of the year, has kind of been this nice thing that builds up into this crescendo that leads into the playoffs, right? Where you got all this kind of tension, all this stress, who's going to make the playoffs. And then you have week 17 where it's winner you get in for a lot of teams. The Browns last year, winning you get in, losing you got to wait for a bunch of tiebreakers, right? So the Browns, they won, they got in, big celebration. Oh, it was so great going into the playoffs off that momentum. Now, instead of having all those winning you're in games at the end of the season, you're going to have it a week before the end of the season, right? Because that last game is still going to be that division game. It's still going to be the one set up to kill all these tiebreakers, and then you play this bonus game against an NFC team that, if you're in a tiebreaker, is virtually useless. So you know what that's going to lead to? A lot of strategic planning for that week, right? A lot of people just being benched, not even traveling, all the nonsense that happens at the end of the season that made us change how they scheduled the end of the season to make sure that it's always division games at the end of the season. That's going to come back because that week 17, well, game 17, I'm sorry, is going to be pretty pointless the way it's laid out. These aren't going to be winning you get in games. This is going to be a lot of teams that are already in and don't really need to play their starters. Or it's going to be teams that just are in that middle ground. They already lost their tiebreaker. They're already bummed out. They know nothing they do can make the playoffs. So they're just in purgatory, right? That's going to be purgatory week in the NFL. A week that's pretty pointless the way it's planned out. And it looks like this is how they want to do it, right? They're just going to throw the 17th game at the end of the season, and they're going to make it interconference. And that is going to make that week so pointless. I don't understand it. I would hope they could make interconference week happen in like the middle of the season and that would work. But for whatever reason, this is how they want to do it. And the 16th game is still going to be the most important regular season game that there is. And then the 17th game is going to be like the Pro Bowl. It's going to be pretty useless for the most part, right? Because these are games that don't really factor into tiebreakers, that can only change things in the rare situation that like you can just gain a game on somebody, which probably is not going to happen. We have seen how these things tend to play themselves out. You don't normally gain an entire game on somebody at the end of the season. So it just seems kind of pointless and kind of ruins a really nice thing about the regular season. And it's not just because there's an extra game. It's because of how they chose to implement it, which is pretty dumb, in my opinion. I just don't understand the implementation of this. Maybe for this year, I get it because you already had the schedules lined up. Teams already booked things. So you just kind of chop this week 17 onto somebody or game 17 onto them like this. But if this is how they plan on doing it going forward, this is bad. And if the plan that I have heard that they are thinking about going forward is going to happen, then that's really bad, which is this ideal of international week, right? Where they have a bunch of neutral site games everywhere but, you know, where these teams are. And that is just bad. I don't want to see a team the week before they play a wild card game be in London. I don't want to see that. That's not what I want. This is a bad idea. If you want to have international week, have it in week 4. Have it at the beginning of the season before all the bye weeks start. Do not put it at the end of the season, because you talk about pointless the way that interconference week is set up that they're doing. It's going to be even more pointless if these games are overseas and interconference, right? So they're coming on at weird times. They're coming on at the morning. Imagine if you're in a win and you get in situation and you got to watch your win and get in game at 6 in the morning. Is that something that you're down to do? Is that something that even sounds good for the television audience? It doesn't sound good for the wild card already. I hate how this sounds for the wild card because it's already kind of a bad thing to be coming back from a trip to overseas. You're jet lagged. You have to come back and you have to play another game. That's already kind of annoying for NFL teams. For that to be the week before the playoffs would be just kind of annoying, but also just needlessly stupid. And that's just looking at it for the teams that have a dog in the race that are going to want to play those games. Imagine the bad teams in that situation, or the teams that are really, really good. Like Patrick Mahomes is never making that trip to London. Like that's not happening. If he has the bye week, he's not going. And if they clinch the playoffs, which they probably will, he's not going. Like you're not getting your stars over to this international game, which I presume you would want the stars over in the international game. So that's going to be a whole haggling thing thing with good teams in the NFL to get them to play their stars in a week 17 or game 17, whatever you want to call it, international game when there's really no reason to. Also, just imagine the chaos of this for mismanaged teams. And I just can't help but think of the 2015 Cleveland Browns when I think of the nightmare scenarios that could happen with this idea. Could you imagine Johnny Manziel with a meaningless game 17 in like London, like where he has to travel? Like, you imagine the lies that would be told, the damage that's going to be done from players trying to just excuse themselves from this really pointless, really stupid, really inconvenient last game that they didn't really even want in the first place. So all in all, with that international week idea, which they say they could implement in a couple of years, I think this is really bad, right? It's bad for the wild card, which is a very important thing to want to protect. It's bad for bad teams. It's really bad for good teams. It's not going to be fun for TV. It's not going to be fun for TV audiences, for fans. I don't see why they would do this. And even if your ideal is we want to grow the game, and I get it, you want to grow the game, you want to make it more popular internationally, why give them a very pointless week of football where you're not going to get the stars because of the way you structured international week, that you're never going to get Patrick Mahomes in that game. You're never going to get Aaron Rodgers in that game, or any good player on a good team that has clinched their playoff spot. They're never going to play in that game. So it just, that idea, the execution of it would be terrible, and just the ideal of it is bad. If you want international week, I'm all for it. Make it early in the season. Get it out the way when that game, still means something. The star players are going to have to play in it, but like not so much that the entire season is on the line. In London, imagine the Buffalo Bills are playing a win and you get in game, but instead of it being at Ralph Wilson, it's at Wembley Stadium with a bunch of people who don't even know who the Buffalo Bills are. That would not make a ton of sense. That would be a terrible, terrible, terrible idea. I cannot stress that enough. Just, if you want to do International Week, just push it, make it week 2. Make week 2 International Week. Get it out the way. Do not make it game 17. Don't do that. Please just stop. So of all these things, and that kind of gets to my point about the 17th game. And that kind of gets to my point about the 17th game is that it can work. It's just not going to be implemented well for a couple of years because the NFL just never really implement these things very well to start with. And it looks like they're off to a bad start on this. To talk about International Week, making it an interconference game to end the season, even though all the games before it are going to be division games. So those last games are going to be pretty pointless. I don't get why they chose to implement it so poorly. I don't get why this vote happened so late in the league year. And I don't get that if this was their best plan, why they didn't wait to do this next year. Now, some people are going to comment, well, it's for the TV contracts and the TV deals. And okay, I get it, I guess. But I think removing just one game for this year so you can implement this thing better so those games actually mean something would be fine for a lot of those contracts. But that's how they're choosing to implement it. There are some good things for the Browns that are going to come out of this, right? I think the more games you play that are out of the division are good ultimately for you, right? Your toughest games are always going to be in division. If you can get an extra game against somebody that's not in your division, that's fine. And, it could be an extra bye. But I'm not against the ideal of a week 17 or a game 17 or week 18, whatever you want to call it. I'm just annoyed by how this is implemented, which is going to be really weird and something which I think has a ton of potential to be anywhere from just weird and kind of pointless and a weird way to end the season like it is currently now, to just a unmitigated disaster if they really make week 17 or game 17, whatever you want to call it, an international game, a neutral site international game. Like, you might as well just be playing the Pro Bowl week 17 if you do that. Matter of fact, make that the 17th game. Just make the Pro Bowl, because that'd be better football than what you would say. it's not good for growing the game. That ideal just boggles my mind that it's being considered and that there are a lot of people who think that's a good idea. I don't get that one. That's my thoughts on Game 17 and how it's going to affect the Browns and the league total. And I guess you guys watching at home, let me know what your thoughts are. Are you just happy for an extra week of football? Or do you think the way the NFL is implementing this is pretty dumb like I do? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. But again, guys, thank you for watching. Have a great day. Have a good night.